Hello and welcome to the Middle East Report. In this programme today we're discussing the very important issue of anti-Semitism, and over the last decade or so we've seen a rapid increase in anti-Semitic instances, not only here in Britain but also throughout Europe and the world. So we'll be asking, what is the role of Christians and how can Christians stand with the Jewish people in confronting this evil? It was over 70 years ago that we saw the horrors of Nazism, in particular the killing of over 6 million Jewish lives lost at the hands of the Nazis. And so we're seeing now in our day a resurgence in anti-Semitism. And so we'll be discussing today the Communities Security Trust's annual report on anti-Semitism in Britain, and how we can actually challenge this and how we can actually confront this, as this is something that is abhorrent, it's evil, and as Christians we should fight this tooth and nail to ensure that we protect the Jewish community here in Britain and in Europe and throughout the world. And I'm joined today by Mark Gardner, who is the Communications Director for the Community Security Trust. Hello Mark, and welcome to the Middle East Report.
Thank you very much indeed, Simon. Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure, and this is something that I feel very, very passionate about, and I know I contacted your organisation a few weeks ago to really look at this issue of anti-Semitism, as I've seen in my course of my own research that shocking levels of anti-Semitism on the continent of Europe. And it's horrible and horrific to see this return in such a violent form. Before we discuss this issue, Mark, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, your background growing up as a Scottish Jew, as it were, there can't be many of you, and your work and how it called you to work with the CST?
Certainly, very happy to do so. I'm Scottish, I'm Jewish, I'm British. I have multiple parts to my makeup, as so many of us do. What can I say? I had a very happy childhood growing up in Glasgow in a very secure family environment. Went to a Jewish primary school, went to a normal state secondary school, if truth be told not a particularly good one. Then I went to university, where I played an active role in my local Jewish society. I was very involved also in a Jewish youth movement called Habanim Dror. And then I came to London. I started working at what is now Community Security Trust. I've been with us for over 20 years now. When I started out, it was the Community Security Organisation, and then we achieved charitable status in 1994 with the help of the then Home Secretary and the then Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police. And that was after the terrorist bombings of the Israeli embassy in London in 1994 and Balfour House, which was a Jewish community centre come Israeli building. And I think in a sense that kind of typifies how you have this crossover very often between the Israel aspect and the Jewish aspect, and also the anti-Semitic aspect.
And can you tell us of the very important work done by CST? I know CST from my work with the Jewish community, and going to any Jewish event or going to a synagogue or a bar mitzvah, for example, you see CST guards absolutely everywhere, making a real physical difference in protecting the Jewish community.
Sure. CST, Community Security Trust, is a charity, as I've already said. We have thousands of trained personnel throughout the country, plus full-time staff in London and also in Manchester and in Leeds. We provide a security network for the Jewish community. If you imagine, well, most buildings where people go to work would have a fire safety officer or a health officer or something like this. Unfortunately, in the Jewish community, we need to have a security officer as well. We know only too sadly and too well the reality not only of anti-Semitism but also of anti-Semitic terrorism. Terrorism is something that I think all of yours today would understand, especially after the events in London in July 2005. Jewish communities have had to put up with terrorism for decades, and it's bad enough when the city as a whole is targeted, if it's the underground for instance. But if you imagine being a member of a minority community which has a history of persecution anyway, and then terrorist attacks come specifically against that community, the impact that has on the lives and also on the long-term morale and the long-term sense of belonging is profoundly negative. And also, would you want to be neighbour to a synagogue or a school, God forbid, that was at risk of a terrorist attack? So this is a very, very difficult and sensitive subject for us to deal with. We believe that we have no option, unfortunately, other than to have this security presence. Thankfully, our work is very strongly supported by the police and by the government, who share our assessment of the situation and our approach to trying to deal with it.
I mean, just looking at the some of these Jewish schools, Jewish youth centres, even Jewish buildings, for example, Jewish charities, the amount of security that are these buildings, even the Israeli embassy. I mean, I've never seen anything so fortified as the Israeli embassy here in London. But that must add up to a real financial burden upon the Jewish community to actually provide for that security.
Yeah, there's a financial burden and there's also a psychological burden. The financial burden runs into millions of pounds per annum. The Jewish community is not that big. I mean, there's only about 300,000 Jews in Britain. So for the Jewish community to fund, it's a very, very charitable and social community, both within the Jewish community and also contributions beyond the Jewish community as well. So this financial burden is a very, very serious one indeed. And if you consider it in respect to a particular school or a particular synagogue, well, they might have a leaking roof that needs fixed. They might have a problem with staffing levels. There are all sorts of things that money needs to be spent upon, and it's a terrible shame that some of that money needs to be diverted for security. When we talk about the psychological burden as well, school security in particular, I think there are many times during the course of a year when as a Jewish parent, people almost forget how scandalous the situation is. And on the one hand, you become normalised to thinking that this is how things just are, which obviously is not how they ought to be. And then when we see terrible events like the awful shootings at the school in Toulouse last week, it's almost as if the normalisation of it flips, and suddenly you're confronted with the reality of the terrorist threat and what it actually means. And then we're trying to roll back and to say, well, that happened in France. It was a terrible tragedy. We don't actually have anything to connect that to the UK. This is why we've got the security. This is why we're supported in the security effort by the government and by the police. We have to try and keep a calm head and lead our Jewish lives as best we can. At the end of the day, CST's role is to facilitate Jewish life and to enable Jews to lead their Jewish lives as they choose or choose not to do.
And I think it's very important, as we're discussing the issue of anti-Semitism today, to ask the question, what is anti-Semitism? What is the definition of anti-Semitism? And what does anti-Semitism constitute?
It's a huge question. There's a very, very simple answer, which is to say that anti-Semitism is just a fancy word for Jew hatred. People who hate Jews, or perhaps people who hate Judaism. We can leave it at that, or we can delve into it. And there are so many different interpretations, different ways of explaining what this thing, anti-Semitism, is. The word itself is quite a ridiculous word. I mean, you can be anti-communism, you can be anti-capitalism. Anti-Semitism, what is the Semitism thing that people are supposedly anti? It's a word that was coined by an anti-Semite, by Wilhelm Marr in 1879. Now, he was proud to be an anti-Semite. This was in the days when people were proud of their anti-Semitism. You don't get people nowadays who are proud of their anti-Semitism. Semitism just means people who speak Semitic languages. So you could be really facile about this, and you could say that anti-Semitism therefore means people who hate those who speak Arabic or those who speak Aramaic. But the use of the word means a hatred of Jews, people who hate Jews, people who hate Jewish things, perhaps people who hate Judaism.
And we've got a clip to go to now that really does look at the rise of anti-Semitism that's occurred across Britain and Europe over the past decade.
It happens every year without any prior notice. In Europe, South America, in far-off Asia, Canada, the US. Anti-Semitism, a phenomenon that is difficult to restrain. Hatred of Jews. This hatred has already led to satanic results. The Holocaust. Author and Nobel laureate Elie Wiesel. Never shall I forget that night, the first night in camp that turned my life into one long night, 7 times sealed. Never shall I forget that smoke. Never shall I forget the small faces of the children whose bodies I saw transformed into smoke under a silent sky. Never shall I forget those flames that consumed my faith forever. Peter Wiesel, Elie Wiesel's nephew, left Budapest because of anti-Semitism.
I don't feel comfortable here. I think all of Europe has a very strong rise of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. The shoes that are here represent when they threw Jews into the Danube, tying barbed wire around them. Nowadays, they put pigs' heads here and pigs' feet into the shoes without fear of retribution.
In Venezuela, there is scalding criticism of Jews. Growing manifestations of anti-Semitism are commonplace.
Constantemente en los medios de comunicación, sea televisión, en radio y en internet, están hablando muy mal de Israel y de los judíos. Mi convicción es que eso realmente viene como de línea gubernamental y va bajando hacia la población.
In France too, manifestations of anti-Semitism are sprouting up all over. These are unacceptable.
Et ce sont des gamins qui s'amusaient d'une manière très violente à lancer des cailloux, des pierres très grosses à la maison. Une autre de mes filles a été attaquée dans la rue, en bas de chez nous. On l'a obligée de se mettre à genoux et de crier « Vive la Palestine », dire à ma fille qui un jour est venue vers moi en disant « Maman, j'aimerais bien ne plus être juive ».
Pelevris, a contemporary Greek writer and historian, wrote the book Jews, the Whole Truth. He was accused of anti-Semitism, but was exonerated in court. A Jewish lawyer who closely followed the case noted that anti-Semitism had penetrated everywhere.
This is something I find it really very representative of his book. The time has come to give the Jew the designation he deserves. What is he who tortures? What is he who shoots? What is he who murders women or unarmed people? What is he who rapes? What is he who wants to drink our blood? What is he who does all this together? He is the subhuman Jew.
Sharansky was a Soviet prisoner of Zion in the Soviet Union. Today, he's standing up to waves of anti-Semitism through every means at his disposal.
These are the faces of anti-Semitism today. We have to recognize them, we have to understand them, and we have to fight against this new anti-Semitism.
Wherever anti-Semitism begins to emerge, we must address it seriously and try to uproot it, for our sakes and for the good of humanity. Because you can identify how and where it begins. How it can end, we all know. This child who saw death in front of his eyes fled with his brother from the death camps. Later on, he stood before Jewish leaders and said,
"This child on the picture, that's me. You, leaders of Jews in diaspora, and all the communities that you represent, you have the chance, you have the opportunity, you are privileged to have the chance to come like the doves who feel that this is their home."
Scapegoating and stereotyping have long been at the heart of religious persecution, and some of its vilest forms have been in anti-Semitic words and acts. Since the turn of the millennium, there has been an increase in violence against Jews in Europe. Arson at Jewish schools, vandalism and desecration of synagogues and cemeteries, as well as attacks and verbal abuse of individuals. It goes without saying that we are all shamed by these incidents, but they are promoted by a small minority of extremists who do not represent the wider communities they claim to. These acts are offensive not just to Jews, but to all supporters of religious freedom and tolerance worldwide. I condemn all instances of violence and discrimination against individuals and groups because of their faith or belief, wherever they occur and whatever the religion of the individual or group concerned.
A few years before I became the world chairman of Keren Hayesod, I served as a minister in the Israeli government. On the day of swearing in to become a minister, my father, who is a Holocaust survivor, told me about his childhood. He told me how he saw his father being killed by the Germans, how he had to hide himself, to look for shelters for years. And he said, you know, as a child, I didn't have childhood. I couldn't imagine myself growing up, having a family, having a son, and if somebody would have told me that I'm going to have a son that will be a minister, and a minister in the Jewish state, I couldn't even imagine something like this being happening. And that was only 60 and something years ago, not too long. I truly believe that as long as the gates of Jerusalem are open, the gates of Auschwitz will remain closed. And this is what Keren Hayesod is all about.
Leading the fight against anti-Semitism, Jewish communities throughout the world must remember that there is one place that must be preserved like the apple of one's eye. There is one place where every Jew, in times of distress, can find a home and feel part of a real, warm and embracing family. The State of Israel.
Welcome back to the Middle East Report. Mark, I think before the programme discussed how recently I was in Brussels and in Belgium and had the privilege to meet with some very prominent Jewish leaders, as well as a few Christian leaders and also some Israeli diplomats and Israel's mission to the EU and Belgium. And what the conclusion I came to after talking to so many of these Jewish leaders was that so many of them are in fear. And many leaders in the Jewish community there are talking about making aliyah to Israel or going to the United States, that there is a real fear with the rise of Islamism, which has led to an increase in anti-Semitism, and the Jewish community there in Belgium and across Europe really feel it. But what's the situation like here in Britain in terms of anti-Semitism?
It's a huge question. It partly depends upon the immediate context within which we discuss it. You know, if something like the terrorist attack on Toulouse is very recent, then obviously this kind of anti-Semitic aspect is uppermost in people's minds. But I think that by and large, people want to return to normality as quickly as possible. And it's really important to contextualize this because as a Jew in Britain today, especially if you're in a centre of large Jewish life, London, Manchester in particular, you can lead whatever Jewish life you want to lead. Religiously, culturally, charitably, whatever you want to do, it's there for you to do. And it's because things are so good that the negatives need to be fought. You know, the glass is both nearly full and yet you have this pressure of anti-Semitism which causes people to really fear not that there's going to be a Holocaust tomorrow, but the trajectory of things at the moment are not good, as you have already alluded to at the beginning of this program. The direction in which things are headed is a bad one. If things continue heading in that direction, what's the future going to be like for the next generation of Jewish kids here? Or the generation after that? So how secure is the future? And if the future is not secure, and if we feel this insecurity, what is it that we're supposed to do about it? Are we supposed to wait for the rest of society to somehow or other change? Or, as you've said, people are contemplating in Europe, do people begin to contemplate going to live in Israel? or elsewhere. Now look, Jewish people are like any other people. Everyone has a fear of crime, yeah? If you're from an ethnic minority, you have a fear of racist crime as well. For some Jews, they're completely not bothered by anti-Semitism. They don't even recognize it as anti-Semitism, perhaps. Other Jews are really, really nervous about the situation. And then you have people all the way in between both ends of the spectrum. So our community, it's not to say that our community is divided on this, it's just to say that our community is like any other group of people. The fear of racism is a very subjective thing that you feel personally. It depends upon your personal experiences and upon your family background. Some people might never suffer from anti-Semitism because they might not look particularly Jewish. So who's going to pick them out from the crowd? They might drive to work. They might get to work and be in a very nice environment. So nobody's expressing racism to them at work. Nobody's expressing racism to them on the way to work. Or you could be somebody who's visibly Jewish. You could live in a neighborhood that isn't particularly nice. You could travel every day on public transport. You could get abused by yobs every day on public transport. You could work in a place where the people are basically racist or mean or bully you. You could come from a family that has fled from the Holocaust. Or you could come from a family that's been in Britain for hundreds of years and is feeling very, very comfortable with everything. So Jewish people have a whole range of responses. Now, it's natural, I think, that the people who feel strongly in one direction or the other will be the ones who make the noise. We're trying really hard to get to the bottom of what are people's emotions. The Fundamental Rights Agency of the European Union is an official pan-European body that studies issues like this. We're working with them right now to put together a very detailed survey in 9 European countries, including the UK, which will look at exactly this. It will try to find a proper cross-representation of Jewish communities, and we'll ask them what their feelings are about anti-Semitism. Once we have that data captured, we can then go to politicians and we can say, this is the experience, how can we work with you to address it?
I hope they do, because I think this is something imperative. And one thing a lot of people don't realise with anti-Semitism, that it may start with the Jewish people, but it certainly doesn't finish with the Jewish people.
Never ends with the Jewish people.
And there are devastating consequences to the world when we see that rise of anti-Semitism, just looking throughout history. And Britain's history, in terms of its treatment towards the Jewish people throughout the Middle Ages, has been shocking. The expulsion of the Jews from this country in 1290 was a crime. It was only thanks to Oliver Cromwell who invited the Jewish people back, and the Jewish people came back also with the pogroms in the 1890s. And I think also there's been so much anti-Semitism coming from the church, and Christianity in particular, which is abhorrent, it's disgusting. And I know that many Christian organisations that have a heart for Israel and the Jewish people have repented of this. And this is something that the Christian community itself needs to tackle a lot more, because we owe a debt and a gratitude to Israel and the Jewish people for giving us our inheritance. And our inheritance is your inheritance. Because we share that unique values, we share that Judeo-Christian heritage that has made Europe given Europe its freedoms, and it's given Europe that enlightenment, and it's come from our shared scriptures. And so we're so grateful to the Jewish people. The one thing I do want to discuss with you as well is how this new form of anti-Semitism has really transformed now on the international stage. And we're seeing horrendous attacks on Israel, this anti-Zionism, this anti-Israel sentiment that is resulting in attacks on vulnerable Jewish communities throughout the world.
Yeah. This is called by some people the new anti-Semitism. I don't really like that phrase so much, but it captures the essence of it, so it's a useful phrase. So let's call it the new anti-Semitism, for want of a better terminology. The reason I don't like it is because we recognise it as anti-Semitism because it's basically the same as the old stuff. It's contemporary anti-Semitism. Now, people, I think a lot of people have this idea in their head that anti-Semitism was burnt out at Auschwitz, in the ovens of Auschwitz. Maybe other people feel that it should have burnt out in the ovens of Auschwitz. I would say to that, the Holocaust was unimaginable before it happened. The fact that it's happened makes the next one more imaginable, both for potential perpetrators and for everybody else, including Jews and the people who are watching this program. Now, let's talk about this thing, the new anti-Semitism. It doesn't really direct itself against Jews per se. It avoids saying that it's talking about Jews. Generally, it talks about Zionists and about Zionism. But the ideology of anti-Semitism, and this is where anti-Semitism differs from the other forms of racism, the ideology of anti-Semitism was always about the power of the Jew and about how the Jew was opposed to the rest of humanity. The origins of Christian anti-Semitism, and they're being embedded in European society for so many centuries. How powerful must the Jews be to have killed Jesus? How evil must the Jews be to have killed Jesus? Look at how despicable and how impoverished the Jews are today. That shows they must have been in league with the devil, and they must conspire. And those themes, made modern, made in a completely contemporary context, have evolved into Nazi anti-Semitism, given a vile twist of race and biological determinism, spun in their own way by communists, far left, anti-Semitism. But after the Holocaust, well, this is a hatred that cannot speak its name anymore. So, something that's so embedded in the culture, does it disappear overnight? Or does it re-emerge in time in a new guise? And I would suggest that if you look at the range and the sheer huge extent of anti-Zionist ideology today, all of the areas within which it touches, all of the things it attacks, you can only make sense of it if you refer it to the anti-Semitic charges that existed at the time of the Nazis and that basically evolved from many, many centuries of European history. And it's a terrible thing to have to say, but if you look at it, there's no other way of understanding it. Zionism is just, for Jews, Zionism is just a belief that Jews should have a homeland. You know, Zionism is not what anti-Zionists say. Anti-Zionists say that Zionism is controlling American foreign policy. America, the world's #1 superpower for so long, controlling American foreign policy to the extent that America goes to war with Iraq, America goes to war with Afghanistan, America supposedly is going to go to war with Iran. And these Zionists are supposedly bringing about a World War III. That's not my definition of Zionism. It's not any normal Jewish person's definition of Zionism. It's not what Zionism is. Also, Zionism is not controlling the global financial system. Globalism is not controlling the world's media. You can go on and on with these things. That's not what Zionism is. And the only way that it can make sense that people say this is what Zionism is to reference it to what people said about Jews up until 1945.
It's very powerful, Mark. We've got a clip to go to now. It's called the fourth mutilation of anti-Semitism, and this is delivered by Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, the chief rabbi.
Anti-Semitism is a virus that mutates. And I begin, with the Hellenistic age, where a lot of people think anti-Semitism began. Actually, I say, although the Greeks and Romans didn't all like the Jews, there was nothing personal. It's exactly like the mafia say when they're about to shoot you. Nothing personal, strictly business. So anti-Semitism, stage one, really got personal with the birth of Christianity and the disappointment of Christians that Jews did not accept one of their own as the Messiah. And that really was personal, because that was a hatred of Jews, not of people in general. The next mutation took place around 1096 with the massacre of Jewish communities in Northern Europe during the First Crusade. And that's when Jews became not just the people who rejected Christianity, but a demonic force. They became the infidel, the antichrist, the children of Satan, who poisoned wells, desecrated the host, and killed Christian children to use their blood to make matzah, the blood libel. That was demonic anti-Judaism. Mutation 3 we can date to 1879 with the birth of this new word, anti-Semitism. And that was not religious hostility to Judaism, but racial hostility to Jews. And that was serious, because in the end, Christians could work for the conversion of Jews. You can change your religion, but you can't change your race. And therefore all you could do was to, God forbid, work for the extermination of the Jews. So I'm afraid the Holocaust was already implicit in that word itself. The fourth mutation that we're living through now is demonic anti-Zionism. It's focused not on Jews as individuals, but Jews as a nation in their own sovereign state, and it accuses Israel of essentially all the ills that medieval Christians, you know, we don't poison wells, but we do poison the world peace. We were responsible for every kind of distress in the universe. 70% of Pakistanis in the days following 9/11 thought that it had been done by the Israelis. The Israelis were blamed for the tsunami at the end of 2004. They've been blamed for more or less everything. And since ipso facto every Jew is a Zionist, then every Jew is a legitimate cause for attack. And that is the new anti-Semitism that's been born in our time. It's every bit as dangerous as the others. But my argument is that Jews must never fight anti-Semitism alone. The victim cannot cure the crime. The hated cannot cure the hate. And so I'm glad to say Britain has become the first country, and surely won't be the last, where the fight against anti-Semitism is led by non-Jews. Well, it's led by a parliamentary committee on anti-Semitism, people of all parties who monitor on a regular basis all forms of anti-Semitism. That report is fed back into government, which assembles an interdepartmental committee, all the departments of government that have any bearing on it, education, health, Home Office, and all that stuff. And all of those committees come together and interface with the Jewish organizations that deal with the symptoms of anti-Semitism. So it is basically a government-led activity. And in 2009, the British Home Office and Foreign Office convened for the first time an international conference of parliamentarians to fight against anti-Semitism. Almost all the participants were not Jewish. And this conference was held and hosted by the British government. The next government to do so has been the Canadian government, which will be doing so this year. And so we've taken this and refused to live by this maxim that we are the people who dwell alone. It is true that we have enemies, but it is also true that we have many very good friends.
Welcome back to the Middle East Report. That was the Chief Rabbi Jonathan Sachs talking about anti-Semitism. Mark, your organisation, the Community Security Trust, produces an annual report, which I think is there in front of you, that looks at anti-Semitic incidences. What have been some of the highlights that have happened in 2011, according to your report?
This is our report. We bring it out every year. It's available on our website in the publications section, www.thecst.org.uk. You can read through it, and it's going to give you some examples of incidents that occurred. Now, it doesn't have every incident because we had well over 500 last year, and most years we have many, many, many hundreds of incidents. Some of them are extremely violent. Some of them are name-calling in the street. Some of them are Nazi graffiti. Some of them are attacks on Jewish cemeteries. Some of them are threatening phone calls to Jewish community organisations. The whole range is covered. We do our best to make some kind of sense of it. It's not a rational subject, but we do try to understand what's going on so that we can work with our community, with the police, with the government, and with friends such as yourselves to grasp what occurs and to come up with strategies and tactics to cope with it.
Yeah. I mean, we're seeing here on our screens now some very, very shocking imagery of attacks on Jewish cemeteries. For example, there's a Jewish guy there beaten up. I mean, having read your report in doing the research for this programme, Mark, I'm shocked. I'm not only shocked, but I'm just horrified that these things could happen again to the Jewish people. And it just makes me very, very angry that this is happening in Britain today. Can you describe some of the instances here and the graffiti, the use of Nazi language that's been attributed to the Jewish community here?
Certainly. I mean, look, the obvious image, Jew scumbags, it's just pathetic, racist graffiti. It's upsetting, it's insulting. You might feel scared. If you walk past a place where Jew scumbags or a swastika, we know what the swastika means. You know, this is about as serious a symbol of hatred as any community could receive. Nazis tried to kill all of the Jews. We see this kind of thing. Some of us might shrug it aside, might say it's the work of just a few nutcases. And it is. It's the work of a real minority of people. But equally, it's really disturbing as well to see. This again is the kind of, it's just rubbish, isn't it?
Absolutely.
It's just absolutely pathetic behaviour. It's not only Jews who suffer from this kind of pathetic behaviour. I mean, any community, minority or majority, because Christians get this as well. Christians also get abuse, suffers from these sorts of things. It can be hard to work out, you know, is this just some stupid idiot thug? Or is this something which, God forbid, might turn actually more serious? Might turn into somebody trying to burn down the building on which the graffiti is put? Or might turn into somebody actually trying to attack Jews physically.
Yeah. Mark, also reading in your report, which was very interesting, seems to be there's spikes in anti-Semitic attacks, whether that's physical attacks, whether that is abuse or attack on Jewish properties, in light of events in connection with Israel. So if Israel carries out a military operation like it did against Hezbollah in 2006, or Operation Cast Lead when it confronted Hamas in Gaza, we saw then through your figures an escalation in attacks against the Jewish community.
This is how racism works. It's also how anti-Semitism works. If there's something which is in the news and it's related to a minority community, then that minority community will suffer a rise in racist attacks. In our experience, when Israel is in the news, particularly in a conflict situation, we see an immediate rise in anti-Semitic incidents. The bigger the conflict, the more news coverage there is of that conflict, whether the coverage is accurate or not actually, but obviously the more hostile it is to Israel's behaviour, the worse the anti-Semitic environment becomes. Now, racists and terrorists are emboldened from the atmosphere that they feel around them. If these people feel that the surrounding environment supports them, they'll be encouraged to go out and commit more attacks. So I'm not saying the media coverage causes the anti-Semitism. You need to be a maniac to watch news coverage involving Israeli government or Israeli army operations and to think that it makes sense, if you're angry about that, to go out and attack a random Jew. I mean, this is lunacy. So I'm not saying that it's the media's fault. The media reports what it reports, but it creates a climate in which people who want to perpetrate anti-Semitic attacks feel encouraged to do so. And sometimes it triggers people who don't think that they're anti-Semitic into doing these things. We have reports, particularly from during the Gaza conflict in 2009, but also from the Hezbollah conflict in 2006. People who, after the event and after they get caught by the police, were absolutely horrified with what they'd done. I'm not anti-Semitic, something inside me just snapped, I don't know why. I was listening to the radio, I was watching the news, I picked up the phone, I yelled abuse down the phone. These are actually, we've got these incidents on tape. I'm watching the news right now, you murdering, I won't use the rest of the foul language that was utilised. And these people I didn't know I was an anti-Semite. I'm mortified that I've done this. Now, never mind when we then start to talk about people who are consciously anti-Semitic, who see this coverage and who think, yep, the mood out there is supportive of my warped thinking. They don't think they're warped. And so they go out and they commit more attacks and worse attacks.
I mean, I find it sickening, and also you bring in the media there. I believe the media has a fundamental role to actually present truth. And here's Israel's situation. If I take Gaza, for example, even recently, Israel left Gaza back in 2005 unilaterally, pulled out almost a community of 18,000 Jewish settlers, said, here you go, this is what we're doing for peace, and instead received nothing but rockets and missile attacks. And when Israel goes to the defence of her communities, facing a terrorist organisation like Hamas, who are based there, who not only call for the destruction of the State of Israel and their charter, but also call for the genocide against the Jewish people, language we haven't seen since the Nazis in the 1930s. And we know the devastating consequences of their beliefs, that Israel goes to defend herself, and they use asymmetric warfare. They hide behind civilian buildings, they fire missiles from mosques, they booby-trap schools in order to make Israel look bad, to demonize them. Is there a case where we have to maybe call for the media, the wider mainstream media, to show more accurate in their reporting so they don't inflame anti-Semitic sentiment that could lead to attacks on your community?
Well, I should stress to your viewers that CST's role is not one of advocacy for Israel. The Jewish community has organisations that do that, and that's not CST's business. We have tried on numerous occasions to discuss with numerous different media outlets the fact that there is a relationship between their coverage of Israel and levels of anti-Semitism. We've not said it's your fault. We've not said that the coverage is fair or unfair. We've said, look, this is the reality of the situation that we deal with as people who have to cope with levels of anti-Semitism in Britain today. Now, you could well argue that we should say explicitly to them, oh, the Israel coverage is wrong here, the Israel coverage is wrong there. We have to take a decision as to whether or not we remain essentially an apolitical organisation that only deals with racism against Jews, or if we enter into the political minefield, which is the Middle East. We choose not to enter into that minefield.
Sadly, we only got 5 minutes left, and this is probably one of the quickest interviews I've ever done, Mark. But I want to raise two issues before we do. I want to focus more on the report and also what the responsibility of Christians can play in supporting the Jewish people against the evil which is anti-Semitism. In the course of just going through your report, I just want to read something, a few things which I found absolutely disgusting. It said in your report there was an incident in 2011 which involved a Jewish family who were filling up their car at a petrol station in Manchester, and one of the family members crossed the forecourt in order to make a payment. A car containing two white females reversed sharply into her, knocking her to the ground. The occupants then got out their car, shouted "Dirty Jew," spat on the injured woman, lying on the ground before getting back into their car and driving away. Another instance in Hertfordshire last February, a Jewish schoolgirl was at a bus stop on her way home from school, and she was slapped on the arm by three older girls who said "Slap a Jew Day," which was organised at an event on Facebook. And another one here that's in Salford last September, two Jewish girls were approached by two Jewish girls, one white, one mixed, and they held a cigarette lighter and threatened to burn you like Hitler. And I just look at some of these instances and say, is this Britain today? I mean, this is just absolutely horrific, and it's shocking, and it makes me very angry.
Yeah, it makes us angry, makes us sad, makes us nervous. I said earlier in the program about context, about the fact that, for all of this, for all that we've said, and my organisation documents these attacks, anti-Semitism is not how British Jews should be defined today. And thankfully, the experiences that we document in our report are not the average daily life experience of the average Jew out there. These are exceptional circumstances. And there will be Christian viewers out there who will have suffered for being Christian, and there will be black viewers who have suffered for being black, etc., etc. Now, it sounds like you're almost explaining it away. There's always going to be some amount of racism, there's always going to be some amount of antisocial behaviour, and therefore there's always going to be Jewish victims and Christian victims and black victims. But really, you mentioned already about the surges in anti-Semitic attacks. You mentioned also about the ideological aspect of anti-Semitism. You touched upon the danger that anti-Semitism shows for the rest of society.
Absolutely.
There are lessons in anti-Semitism and in understanding the phenomenon today that are really important for the rest of society to grasp, and for Jewish communities to grasp.
Got 2 minutes left, Mark, so it's going very quickly, but how can our viewers who are passionate for Israel, they're passionate and standing up for the Jewish people, really get involved in this fight, which is our fight as well, against anti-Semitism and the evils of anti-Semitism?
That's the most important question you've asked me. How can the viewers and how can the wider Christian community support the Jewish community in all of this? The first thing to say is the presence of this program and the fact that so many tens of thousands of people are watching it is actually incredibly heartening. There's nothing worse than feeling that you're alone as a victim, and just knowing that you have this moral support that's out there, and maybe largely a silent support, but that's very, very important. And then call anti-Semitism when you see it. When you see it in your daily lives, and especially if you ever see it in a church or in a Christian aspect, call it for what it is. And if you think that the criticism of Israel or the criticism of Zionism might be anti-Semitic, whatever, get your facts in order, address the issue. Because I tell you, if nobody addresses these things, the way that our enemies, our mutual enemies, think only becomes worse. That's called groupthink, and it happens when nobody challenges them. You have to challenge them, because you have to make them draw back in their positions, not move forward with them.
Yeah. Mark, I just want to thank you so much for being my guest today on the Middle East Report, and I think we need to go in more depth in this issue, because I think we've only just touched the surface of it. So I'd love to have you back in the seat in maybe a few weeks' time. And I want to thank all of you watching today. I mean, this is the challenge of our time. This is the challenge of our generation. We have to make sure that we learn the lessons of history, that once again the Jewish people do not suffer at the hands of anti-Semitism. When we saw the rise of Hitler, we saw the rise of Israel, the rise of Nazism, with the destruction of the Jewish people across Europe. Over 6 million Jews perished at the hands of the Nazis. Let us in our time stand against anti-Semitism, and let's confront this evil by standing with Israel and the Jewish people, and let's speak out against this evil, which is anti-Semitism. And we're leaving you with a song as a reminder of what happens when we don't challenge the evil that is known as anti-Semitism.
Scattered people, nowhere to go. And the mothers and fathers and the sons and daughters, they were carried away in trains. Their bodies were broken and beaten and burned, and their ashes fell down like rain. They were branded with a number and a yellow star, and paraded around in shame. They called it a crime to be born a Jew, and in the name of God they were slain. The forgotten people. Calling out, calling out, calling out. 6 million people. Crying out, crying out, crying out. The forgotten people. Calling out, calling out, calling out. The chosen people. Crying out, crying out, crying out. Blessed people who tried to help, while evil people schemed among themselves. Everyday people who ignored the news. Oh, indifferent people sitting in the pews. Sound the alarm, shouting never again. Let the righteous revolution begin. History must never repeat itself, so lift your voices and take a stand. United as one for Zion's sake, undivided as the nations rage. We've got to rise like an army in the day, for the nation that was born in a day. The forgotten people. Calling out, calling out, calling out. 6 million people. Crying out, crying out, crying out. The forgotten people. Calling out, calling out, calling out. The chosen people. Crying out, crying out, crying out.
בארץ ישראל קם העם היהודי. בא דמותו הרוחנית, הדתית והמדינית. חי חיי קוממיות ממלכתית. יצר שני תרבות לאומיים וכלל אנושיים.
The forgotten people. Calling out, calling out. 6 million people. Crying out, crying out, crying out. Can you hear them crying out again?
Die Bibel sagt, ich, der Herr, dein Gott, bin ein eifernder Gott.
The Bible says, "For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing the children for the sin of the fathers to the 3rd and 4th generation of those who hate me, but showing love to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commandments." Lord, I hear the cries of 6 million of your people, men, women, children, murdered, annihilated in the Holocaust, and burnt. We confess these atrocities as sin and humble ourselves before you in shame. You have heard our plea, and our repentance has come before your ears. Lord, I see black smoke. It rises up and spreads out like a veil of darkness over the nations again. The dark veil is the sin of our silence. Just as we Germans have remained silent, the peoples and the nations are silent once again. Again, your people Israel are hated, despised, and rejected, and yet we remain silent. Even in the church, we are silent concerning the sin of our fathers. We remain silent, and behold, the black smoke is covering us again. From the land of unmerited grace, we are calling out, nations arise, for Zion's sake, open your mouth, never again, slander, hatred, or death. Israel, we will never forsake you again. You are our inheritance, our love, the blessing for all nations. Listen, receive the word.